Time for a new Indian in the Cupboard book, The Secret of the Indian. Chapter 1, A Shocking Homecoming. When Omri's parents drove home from their party, his mother got out in front of the house while his father drove around the side to put the car away. The front door key was on the same key ring with the car key, so his mother came up the steps and rang the bell. She expected the babysitter to answer. There was a lengthy pause, and then the door opened. There was Omri, with Patrick just behind him. The light was behind him, too, so she didn't see him clearly at first. "Good heavens, are you boys still up? You should have been in the bed hours ago." And then she stopped. Her mouth fell open, and her face drained of color. "Omri, what's happened to your face?" She could hardly speak properly, and that was when Omri realized that he wasn't going to get away with it so easily this time. This time, he was either going to have to lie like mad, or he was going to have to tell far more than he had ever intended about the Indian, the key, the cupboard, and all the rest of it. He and Patrick had talked about it frantically before his parents returned. "How are you going to explain the burn on your head?" Patrick asked. "I don't know. That's the one thing I can't explain." "No, it's not. What about all the little bullet holes and all the stuff in your parents' bedroom?" Omri's face was furrowed, even though every time he frowned it hurt his burn. "Well, maybe they won't notice. They both need glasses. Do you think that we should clear everything up in there?" Patrick had said, "No, better to leave it. After all, they've got to know about the burglars. Maybe in all the fuss about that, they won't even notice your face and a few other things." "Well, how should we explain how we got rid of them? The burglars, I mean." "Well, we could just say that we burst in through the bathroom and scared them away." Omri had grinned lopsidedly. "Well, that makes us out to be heroes." "So what's so bad about that? Anyway, it's better than telling them." Patrick, who had once been quite keen to tell about them, now realized perfectly clearly that this was about the worst thing that could happen. "But where is the wretched babysitter? Why didn't she come? How dare she not turn up when she promised?" Omri's father was stamping up and down the living room in a fury. His mother, meanwhile, was holding Omri around the shoulders. He could feel her hand cold and shaking right through his shirt. After her first shocked outburst, when she'd come home and seen him, she'd said very little. His father, on the other hand, couldn't seem to stop talking. "You can't depend on anyone. Where the heck are the police? I called them hours ago." It was 5 minutes, in fact. "One would think that we lived on some remote island instead of in London, the biggest city in the world. You pay the salaries, and when you need the police, they're never, ever here, never." He paused in his pacing and gazed around wildly. The boys had put the television back, and there wasn't much disorder in this room. Upstairs, they knew chaos and endless unanswerable questions waited. "Tell me again what happened." "There were burglars, Dad," Omri said patiently. This part was safe enough. "3 of them. They came in through that window." "How many times have I said we ought to have locks fitted? Idiot that I am, for the sake of a few lousy pounds. Well, go on. "Well, I was asleep in here, in the living room. Why?" I just was. And I woke up and I saw them, and they didn't see me, so I nipped upstairs and..." His father, desperate to hear the story, was still too agitated to listen to more than a sentence of it without interrupting. "And where were you, Patrick?" Patrick glanced at Omri for guidance. Omri shrugged very slightly with his eyebrows. He didn't know himself how much to say and what to keep quiet about. "I was, in Omri's room, asleep." All right. Then what?" Omri came up and woke me and said there were burglars in the house and that we ought to, And he stopped. "Well," barked Omri's father impatiently. "Well, stop them." Omri's father turned back to Omri. "Stop them? 3 grown men? How could you stop them? You should have locked your bedroom door and let them get on with it." "They were nicking our TV and stuff." "So what? Don't you know the sort of people they are? They could have hurt you seriously." "Well, they did hurt him seriously," interrupted Omri's mother in a shrill voice. "Look at him. Never mind the interrogation now, Lionel. I wish you'd go and phone Basia and find out why she didn't come, and let me take Omri upstairs and look after him." So Omri's father returned to the hall to phone the babysitter, while his mother led Omri upstairs. But when she switched the bathroom light on and looked at him properly, she let out a gasp. But that's a burn, Omri. How did they do that to you? And Omri had to say, they didn't do it, Mum. Not that. That was something else. She stared at him in horror, and then controlled herself and said as calmly as she could, All right, never mind now. Just sit down on the edge of the bath and let me deal with it. And while she was putting on ointment with her cold, shaky hands, his father came stamping up the stairs to say that there was no reply from their babysitter's number. How could she not come? He stormed. How could she leave you boys alone here? Of all the criminally irresponsible, wait till I get a hold of her. Well, what about us? Asked Omri's mother very quietly, winding a bandage around Omri's head. Us? Yes, us. Going out to the party before she even got here. Well, but we trusted her. We thought that she was just a few minutes late. But his voice petered out, and he stopped stamping about and went into their bedroom to take off his coat. Omri heard the light being switched on, and he bit his lip in suspense. Am I hurting, darling? And he had no time to shake his head before his father burst back in. What in God's sweet name has been going on in our bedroom? Patrick, who was hanging out in the doorway to the bathroom, exchanged a grim look with Omri. Well, Dad, that's where the battle. I mean, that's where they were when we caught them. Battle? That's just what it looks like. It's a battlefield. Jane, come in here and look. Omri's mother left him setting on the bath and went through into the bedroom. Omri and Patrick, numb and speechless with suspense, could hear them exchanging gasps and exclamations of amazement and dismay. And then both his parents reappeared. Their faces had changed. Omri, Patrick, I think we'd better hear the whole story before the police arrive. Come in here. With extreme reluctance, the boys went through the dividing door between the bathroom and the bedroom for the second time that evening. The place looked terrible. All the dressing table drawers and those of the chest of drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn about. The double bed had been knocked askew. A chair had gone flying. The wardrobe door was swinging open. Omri had set his mother's little jewel cupboard back on its feet, but its door, too, was open. But with the lights full on, the thing the boys were most painfully aware of was the holes, little pinholes made by the tiny bullets, and not so little ones made by the miniature mortars and hand grenades that had missed their targets and hit the walls, and the head and foot of the bed. It seemed ludicrous to Omri now, looking at them, that he'd even had a faint hope that his parents might not notice them. They might be a bit nearsighted, but after all, they weren't blind. The room looked pockmarked. And indeed, his father was already putting his fingers over the white wall above the bed head. What's been going on here, boys? He said in a new tone of voice. Patrick and Omri glanced at each other, opened their mouths, and closed them again. Well? It wasn't a bark this time, it was just a question filled with curiosity. After all, from a grown-up's point of view, what could make those tiny marks? At that moment, there was a loud policemanly ring and double knock on the door. Omri's father gave the boys a look that said, This is only a short postponement, and left the room. They heard him running downstairs, and they all trailed after him. Halfway down, he paused. Good Lord, did you see this, Jane? I didn't notice as we came up. One of the banisters has been broken. Eager to explain something that could be explained, Omri volunteered the information that one of the burglars had fallen downstairs in his hurry to get out. His father looked up at him. You boys must have thrown a real scare into them. Lionel, said Omri's mother suddenly. What? Shouldn't we hear what the boys have to say before the police talk to them? And he hesitated. The bell rang commandingly. Too late now, he said, and he hurried to open the door to the police. All right, guys, we're on chapter number 2. Told you they were short. Modest Heroes. As the two uniformed policemen were shown into the living room and Omri's mother hurried down to them, Omri and Patrick had a welcome moment to themselves at the top of the stairs. You look like a sick in that bandage, said Patrick. Well, half a sick. Never mind what I look like. What are we going to do? Patrick said nothing for a moment, and then he said, Make something up, I suppose. What else can we do? All right, but what? What that anyone would believe for 2 seconds? Well, we might try to say that the skinheads did the damage to the wall. We might say that they had, well, I don't know, a spiked tool or a gimlet or chisel or whatever, and just stuck them into everything for a laugh. Or we could say that we don't know how they did it. We burst in, they run, and that's it. Leave the cops to figure it out. Well, if they really look, they'll find minute bullets in the bottoms of the holes. They won't. Why should they even think to? Boys, come down here, will you? It was Omri's dad calling peremptorily. They started to walk as slowly as they dared down the stairs. And you're Burn, whispered Patrick. Well, maybe we might say that we'd had a bonfire in the garden and that you cracked me over the head with a lighted branch. Oh, great. Try saying that and I really will crack you. So that was it. They didn't try to explain the little holes, and the police, assuming that the skinheads had been vandals as well as burglars, didn't examine them too closely. They went over everything else for fingerprints, but said that although that there were quite a few, the chances were against them catching the thieves, who, technically speaking, weren't thieves at all, because they hadn't actually gotten away with anything. Omri told the bonfire story without bringing Patrick into it. He just said the inspiration of the moment, that they'd used a whole can of lighter fluid to get the fire going, and that he, Omri, had struck the match while his face was over the wood. His parents, who had been positively bursting with pride at the way the boys had rid the house of the intruders, abruptly changed their views about Omri's brilliance. How could you be so unutterably daft as to light a fire like that, you little half-wit? His father expostulated. How many times have I told you? A cough came from one of the policemen, interrupting him. Excuse me, sir, were these two lads alone in the house? Because as you no doubt know, sir, it is severely frowned upon to leave any young person under the age of 14 alone in a house at night. Well, of course I know that, Sergeant. We never ever do it. But we always have a babysitter, very punctual and reliable. She was due at 7 tonight, and when we went out, we assumed she was a couple of minutes late. She's never let us down before. And where is this person, sir? Oh, she never showed up, Sergeant, said Omri's father shamefacedly. Yes, I know what you're going to say, and you're perfectly right. We are to blame, and I shall never forgive myself. I dare say you will, sir, said the sergeant levelly. In time, but it would have been much harder to forgive yourself if worse had befallen. Both Omri's parents hung their heads miserably, and Omri moved closer to his mother, who looked as if she might burst into tears. This is not exactly what you call a salubrious neighborhood, especially after dark, went on the policeman. Only this evening a lady was mugged at the end of your street, pulled right off her bicycle. Her bicycle. This was from Omri's mother, whose head had come up sharply. Yes, Mom? Who was she? This lady who was mugged? The sergeant glanced at his companion. Do you remember the name, George? George shrugged. Some Polish-sounding name. Omri's mother and father exchanged horrified looks. Not, was it, Miss Brankowski? Something like that. But that's her, our babysitter, cried Omri's mother. Oh, heavens, poor Basia. Basia? Inspired the young policeman. Is that her name? Or what happened to her? And as he suppressed a snigger, but the sergeant gave him a stern look, and he subsided. There's nothing humorous about it, George. No, Sergeant, sorry. You'll be glad to hear that she's not badly hurt, madam, but she had to go to the hospital just for a checkup, like. The muggers got her bag, though. Oh, is she terrible? What kind of district have we come to live in? Ah, thought Omri. Now maybe they'll realize what I've been going through, walking along Hobble Road to the station every day. They'd never accepted before that it was a horrible area, and that he'd been scared. The policeman took all the details and descriptions of the skinheads. Could you identify them if you saw them again? Asked the sergeant. No, said Patrick. Omri said nothing. He knew he would see them again, like on Monday morning on the way to school. Whether he would turn them in or not, he had yet to decide. Adil and Gillen came home from their film just as the police were leaving. And who are these young gentlemen? Asked the sergeant. They're Omri's elder brothers. What's going on? Asked Adil. Well, we've had burglars, said Omri quickly. What? Yelled Gillen. They didn't get my stereo, did they? They didn't get a thing, their father said proudly. Omri and Patrick chased them off. The older boys gaped at each other. Them in what army? Asked Gillen. Patrick stifled a sudden nervous giggle. Only a little one, he murmured. Omri nearly felled him with a heavy nudge. There was a lot more talking to do. Adil and Gillen had to hear the whole story, except that, of course, it was nothing like the whole story all over again. They were absolutely agog, and even Gillen could find nothing sarcastic to say about the way Omri and Patrick had dealt with the situation. Well, you're a pair of nutters, was the worst he could think of. Those thugs could have flattened you. How did you know that they didn't have knives? But there was more than a hint of admiration in his reproof. Adil, the eldest, said, Right pair of heroes, if you ask me. We could have cleared them out. And he gazed lovingly. Not this at his little brother, but at the television set. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning by the time that they drained the last of their hot chocolate and had been gently shooed off to bed by Omri's mother. She gave Omri a special hug, being careful of his head, and hugged Patrick too. You're fantastic kids, she said. Omri and Patrick looked uncomfortable. It simply didn't seem right to either of them that they were getting all the credit for driving off the intruders single or double-handed, when in fact they'd had a great deal of help. As soon as they got up to Omri's bedroom in the attic, they locked the door and they made for the desk. They had to make a hasty decision before the return of the parents to leave things as they were, not to send anyone else back after they had dispatched Corporal Willie Thickets and his men. As Patrick pointed out, we don't know how the wounded would stand the journey. Besides, we can't send the Indians back to their home without Matron. We can't send her back to hers without them. And we certainly can't send them all anywhere together. And Omri had agreed. But they'd both been on tenterhooks all the time the police had been in the house, for fear that they'd demand to see Omri's room. The boys had been very careful to say that the burglars hadn't got beyond the second floor of the house. Now the boys bent over the desk, and they left Omri's bedside light on in case Matron had to tend one of the wounded Indians in the night. She herself now sat upright, but clearly dozing, at a small circular table made of the screw top of Timotoi shampoo bottle, a good shape because it had a rim that she could get her knees under. On it lay a tiny clipboard, which she had brought with her from St. Thomas's Hospital. She had been making up her notes and temperature charts. On either side of the floor on the longhouse stretched a double row of pallet beds. Each bed was occupied by a wounded Indian. Matron's ministrations had been so efficient that all were resting peacefully. She had earned her little nap, though she would probably deny hotly later that she had nodded off while on duty. Outside the longhouse, beside the burnt-out candle, a blanket was spread on the soil in Omri's father's seed tray. Curled up asleep on the blanket were Little Bear and Bright Stars, his wife. Between them, in the crook of Bright Star's arm, lay their newborn baby, Tall Bear. All these people, when they were standing up, were no more than 3 inches tall. All right, guys, our next chapter, Chapter 3, How It All Started. It had all started more than a year before with an old tin medicine cabinet that Gillen had found, a key that fitted it, which had belonged to Omri's great-grandmother, and the little plastic figure of an American Indian that Patrick had given Omri secondhand for his birthday. On that fateful night, Omri had put the Indian into the small metal cupboard and locked it with the fancy key. There was no particular point to this, really. Thinking back later, Omri didn't know why he'd done it. He'd had a thing at the time about secret cupboards, drawers, rooms, hiding places, kept safe from prying eyes, where he could secrete his favorite things and be sure that they'd stay exactly as he left them, undisturbed by rummaging brothers or anyone else. But the Indian didn't say as he'd left it. Some combination of key and cupboard, plus the stuff the Indian was made of, plastic, had worked the wonder of bringing the little man to life. At first, when this happened, Omri, once past the first shock of astonishment, had thought that he was in for the fun trip of all time. A little live man of his very own to play with, but it hadn't turned out like that. The Indian, Little Bear, was no mere toy. Omri soon found out that he was a real person, somehow magicked into present-day London, England, from the America of nearly 200 years ago, the son of a chief of the Iroquois tribe, a fighter, a hunter, with his own history and his own culture, his own beliefs and morals, his own brand of courage. Little Bear regarded Omri as a magic being, a giant from the world of the spirits, and was at first terrified of him. Omri could see that he was afraid, but the Indian was incredibly brave and controlled, and Omri soon began to admire him. He realized that he couldn't treat him just as a toy. He was a person to be respected despite his tiny size and relative helplessness. And it soon turned out that he was by no means the easiest person in the world to get along with or satisfy. He had demands, and he made them freely, assuming Omri to be all-powerful. He demanded his own kind of food, a longhouse, such as the Iroquois used to sleep in, a horse, although previously he had never ridden, weapons, animals to hunt, and a fire to cook on and dance around. Eventually, he even demanded that Omri provide him with a wife. In addition, Omri had to hide him and protect him. It needed only a little imagination to realize what would happen if any grown-up should find out about the cupboard, the key, and their magic properties. Because Omri soon found out that not just Little Bear, but any plastic figure or object would become alive or real by being locked in the cupboard. But he couldn't keep the secret entirely to himself. His best friend Patrick eventually found out about it and lost no time in putting his own little plastic man into the cupboard. And so, Boo-Hoo Boone, the crying Texas cowboy, had come into their lives, complicating things still more. For, of course, cowboy and Indian were enemies and had to be kept apart until a number of adventures, and their common plight, being tiny in a giant's world, brought them together and made them friends, and even blood brothers. Omri brought the plastic figure of the Indian girl and brought her to life as a wife for Little Bear, and shortly thereafter, that it was decided, with deep reluctance by the boys, that having 3 little people and their horses around amid all the dangers that threatened them in the boys' time and world was more than they could cope with. It was just too much responsibility, so they sent them back for the cupboard, and Key worked also in reverse, transforming real miniature people back into plastic and returning them to their own time. Omri hadn't intended ever to play with this dangerous magic again. It had been too frightening, too full of problems, and too hurtful. At the end, when he had parted with friends he had grown so fond of, but as with so many resolutions, this one got broken. About a year later, by which time Omri and Patrick's families had both moved, Omri won a prize in an important competition for a short story. The story he wrote was called The Plastic Indian, and was all about, well, it was the truth, but of course no one thought of that. They just thought Omri had made up the most marvelous tale, and he was so excited. The prize was £300. He was to receive it at a big party in a London hotel, and even his brothers were impressed. That he decided to bring Little Bear back to life, just long enough to share his triumph with him, since he had been such a vital part of it. Unfortunately, things were not so simple. When Omri put Little Bear, Bright Stars, and their pony, the plastic figures of them, back in the cupboard, they emerged much changed. Little Bear lay across the back of his pony with 2 musket balls in his back, very near death. There had been a battle in his village between his tribe and their enemies, the Algonquians. Together with the French soldiers, Omri had already learned that the French and English had been fighting in America at this time, and Little Bear's tribe was on the English side. You guys remember that? You remember what war it was? The French and Indian War. Little Bear had been wounded. Bright Stars, although on the point of having a baby, had been rushed out and heaved Little Bear onto his pony just as the magic worked, bringing them, tiny as before but as real as ever, and in desperate trouble, to Omri's attic bedroom. And thus, it was that Omri was launched into a whole series of new and even more hair-raising and challenging adventures. Luckily, Patrick was nearby and was able to help with some excellent ideas. Boone came back, too, and they also brought to life a hospital matron from a much more recent era to help save Little Bear's life. Later, when he demanded to go back to his village, a British Royal Marine Corporal, Willie Fickets, and a contingent of Iroquois braves were brought to life to help take revenge on the Algonquians. At this point, there was a most incredible turn of events. Boone the cowboy suggested that the boys go back to Little Bear's time and witness the battle. Of course, they thought it was impossible. How could they fit in the little bathroom cupboard, only about a foot high? But Boone pointed out that the magic key might fit something larger, the old seaman's chest that Omri had bought in the market, for instance. It worked. Each boy climbed in turn, and the other one turned the key, and each separately went back in time to the Iroquois village. When Omri got back, terribly shaken after witnessing a horrific battle, his hair was singed, and he had a burn blister on the side of his head. The boys brought the Indian troop back through the magic of the key, discovering, to their horror, that the modern weapons that they had given Little Bear's men, Little Bear called them now guns, had proved too much for fighters accustomed to bows and arrows. Many of them had been accidentally shot by their own side. Matron had to be brought back to treat their wounds, but 8 had been killed. Little Bear was distraught, but Bright Stars comforted him by putting his new son, Tall Bear, in his arms, and Omri and Patrick took the blame. They shouldn't have sent modern weapons back into the past, but these worked very well when later 3 skinheads tried to burgle the house. The boys brought some plastic Marines to life and mounted an artillery assault on them just as they were rifling Omri's parents' bedroom and completely routed them. It was exhilarating while it lasted, but now they were faced with the aftermath, reality, the present, the result of the night's doings. So if you couldn't tell about Chapter 3 already, that one was to catch everybody up and remind you all of everything that happened. All right. Thank you so much for listening to Chapter 3. And as I told you the other day, we are going to cram 5 chapters into this one, okay? So let's go. Chapter 4, Dead in the Night. The 2 boys sat on the floor of Omri's bedroom and conferred in low voices. "We've got a plan what to do," said Patrick. "One of us must be up here in your room and guard every minute of the rest of the weekend. We'll have to keep your door locked from the inside. Whoever's not here will have to bring food and stuff, so I'd better stay up here most of the time. It'll look dead odd if I start nicking stuff from your kitchen. I don't know what we're going to do on Monday." Omri said heavily, "I do. I'll have to go to school, and you'll have to go home." "Oh, God, yes," said Patrick, remembering. Patrick now lived in Kent with his mother. They were in London only for a brief visit to his aunt and girl cousins, Emma and the dreadful Tamsin. You guys remember Tamsin, the one that had Matron? They'd have been back in their country home already if Tamsin had not fallen off her bicycle and hurt herself, so that Patrick's mother had decided to stay on for a day or two to help his aunt. The boys sat in heavy silence. Omri could hardly bear the thought of being left alone in this increasingly difficult situation. Patrick could hardly bear the thought of leaving it. "Well, maybe Tamsin will die," Patrick said darkly, "and then we'll have to stay on for the funeral." Omri hoped that this was only a sick joke. He detested Tamsin, but he didn't wish her dead. Not now that he'd seen death. Not with those 8 small blood-stained bodies lying under the torn-up scraps of sheet right here in his room. "Well, what are we going to do about the casualties?" he asked. "You mean the dead ones? Well, we'll have to bury them." "Well, where?" "In your garden." "But we just can't. I mean, it's not like when Boone's horse died. They're people. We can't just stick them in the earth. What about their families?" "Well, the families are... Well, they're back somewhere. We don't know where they are or when they are." "Well, maybe we ought to send them back through the cupboard to their own time. Send their dead bodies back with modern bullets in them. Their people would think that they'd been shot by white men. They wouldn't examine them. They'd go through, whatever special rituals that they have and bury them properly or whatever they do with dead people." Abruptly, Omri felt his eyes begin to prick, and a hard, hot lump came into his throat. He put his head down on his knees. Patrick must have been feeling the same, because he squeezed Omri's arm sympathetically. "It's no good feeling it too much," he said after clearing his throat twice. "I know it's terrible, and I know it's partly our fault, but they lived in very dangerous times, fighting and risking death every day, and they went into the battle quite willingly." "Well, they didn't know that they were up against with now guns," said Omri in a muffled voice. "Yeah, I know, but still it doesn't help to be a Boone." The weak joke about the crybaby cowboy made Omri chuckle just a little. "Where is Boone, by the way?" he asked, sniffling back his tears. "I told you. I sent him back. He asked me to. I gave him a new horse, and he went off. Look." He opened the cupboard, and on the shelf was Boone, standing beside his new horse, a tall, alert-looking black one. On the floor of the cupboard, Corporal Fickets and his men were clustered together with their various weapons. Patrick gathered them all up, but put the soldiers back in the biscuit tin, but kept Fickets and Boone separate. Boone went into his pocket, horse and all. He always kept him there, when he wasn't real, for luck. He was actually as fond of Boone as Omri was of Little Bear. Omri put Fickets in the back pocket of his jeans. "The only thing we can do right now is to get some sleep," Omri said. Patrick settled down on the floor cushions while Omri clambered up on the bunk bed under the skylight. He looked up at the stars through the branches of the old elm tree, which his father kept saying should be cut down because it was dead. Skeletal as it was, to Omri it was a friend. Let's bring Boone back tomorrow," Patrick whispered, just before they dropped off. "I don't seem to be able to face things without Boone, whether he cries or not. Besides, I want to know if he likes his new horse." At dawn, Omri was awakened by a familiar shout.
Omri, wake. Day come. Much need do.
Omri, feeling sticky-eyed and thick-headed with tiredness, slid backwards down the ladder to the floor. Patrick was still sound asleep. The gray dawn light was just creeping in through the skylight. "It's dead early, little bear," he muttered, rubbing his face and stifling a series of yawns. Little Bear didn't hear him properly. He caught only his name and the word dead. He nodded his hard-muscled face once and grunted. "One more dead in the night." Omri's throat closed up with a sick feeling. "Another? Oh no, I'm sorry." He meant sorry ashamed, not just sorry regretful. He felt every dead Indian brave was on his own conscience. He should never have made the modern weapons real, had never sent Little Bear and his braves back in time with them. The trouble was, he seemed still not to fully have accepted the fact, which he knew with one part of his brain, that these little people were not just toys come to life. They were flesh and blood with their own characters, their own lives and destinies, and against his own intentions, Omri had been drawn in. He'd found himself acting out his own part in these destinies, which would never have been possible but for the magic of the cupboard and the key. The key turned any container into a kind of body-shrinking time machine. His seaman's chest had taken him and Patrick back to the 18th century, to Little Bear's time and place. Omri had not had time so far even to begin thinking about the possibilities of that. And now he scanned the seed tray and saw that 2 of his Indians who had not been injured were carrying another body out of the longhouse and into the little paddock. Patrick had made with miniature fencing for the ponies, and which was now a makeshift morgue. Matron followed the sad procession, her face rather grim at all times, now grimmer than ever. "I did my best," she said shortly. "Bullet lodged in the liver. I couldn't reach it." She watched the 2 braves lay the dead Indian down beside the others. Suddenly she turned to face Omri. "I know I did that operation on your friend," she said. "And I operated last night. Emergency ops, 3 of them. But blow it all, I'm not a surgeon. Stupid of me. Conceited. To think that I could cope. Can't. Not trained for it. Anyway, too much for any one person." Her voice cracked. "Matron, it's not your fault," began Omri, terrified that this capable, efficient, down-to-earth woman might be about to burst into tears, which would have unmanned him completely. "I didn't say it was my fault indeed." She glared at him, took her spectacles off, polished them on a spotless handkerchief from her apron pocket, and put them back on her formidable nose. "Blessed if I know how I got here, but what is this all about? Why don't you go pulling the wool over my eyes? I know when I'm dreaming and when I'm not. This is real. The blood's real, the pain's real, the deaths are real. My ops were real. They were the best I could do. But what is also real is my basic inadequacy." And guys, if you don't know what inadequacy means, it means you're not good enough to do something. So she's saying that she's not good enough to operate on them. She suddenly snatched the handkerchief out of her pocket again and blew her nose on it. She wiped her nose back and forth several times and then gave a great convulsive sniff. "What we need here is a properly equipped medical team." Omri gaped at her. "If we don't get one, and quickly, more of these poor men are going to die." After a moment, during which she glared at him expectantly through her spectacles, Omri said slowly, "I'll tell you the truth about your being here, and all the rest of it, but you probably won't believe me. After what I've been through in the past 48 hours, I'll believe anything," she said fervently. He explained things as well as he could. She listened intently and asked a couple of questions. "You say any article or figure made of plastic is affected?" "Yes." "And objects that might be concealed on the person, my hypodermic syringe, for example, and other things I brought in my pocket from St. Thomas's?" "Yes, they made those real, provided the person had them on him before he was brought." "Well, why can't you get a hold of some plastic doctors and put them in your allegedly magic cupboard? Only you must make sure that they have some equipment, surgical instruments, and so forth." But all the shops are shut. How can I? Suddenly, Omri remembered. 2 nights ago, he'd gone to see Patrick at his aunt's house, and they had tried to borrow Tamsin's new box of plastic figures, only she had caught them at it and grabbed it back. Omri had just managed to get a hold of one of the figures that turned out to be Matron, but there had been others in the set, including a surgeon and an operating table. He stretched out his foot and nudged Patrick awake. "Patrick, listen. There's another Indian dead, and Matron says if we don't find a proper doctor, more will die." Patrick scrambled to his feet, rubbing his hair. "How can we get any new ones on Sunday?" "Well, what about the ones Tamsin has?" "What are you saying? That I should go back to Auntie's and nick them when Tamsin isn't looking? It's only borrowing." "Not when the owner doesn't know or agree. Not when the owner's my little creep of a cousin. She'd have my guts for garters." Omri said with a note of desperation, "Well, what are we going to do then? This is a real emergency." Suddenly he had an idea. "Why don't you try buying them off of her?" "Well, it might work. Have you got any dosh?" "Not a penny. We spent it all on the Indian braves. Maybe Dad will lend me a couple of quid." Omri's dad did better than that. He gave them £5, and not just till payday. "You've earned it. Here's one for Patrick, too." So there was no problem about money. At breakfast, hastily eaten, the boys sneaked some crispy bits of bacon and quite a few crunchy nut flakes into their pockets, and Omri astonished his mother by asking for a mug of tea instead of milk. Matron couldn't cope without her tea. "I thought you hated tea." "Well, I'm coming around to it."
Well, you'll be hitting the Scotch next, commented his father from behind his Sunday paper. Patrick nudged Omri. When whiskey was mentioned, there was just one person who came to mind. Halfway back up the stairs, Patrick whispered, "Let's bring Boone back to life right now before I leave." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Omri went back and opened the door. Then he gaped. Outside stood Tamsin, of all people. How could it be? She'd broken her leg. Omri looked again. It wasn't Tamsin. It was Emma. Emma was Tamsin's twin sister. She was the spitting image of Tamsin, and yet she was wholly different. As far as Omri could remember, she was quite a decent sort of girl. "Hello, Omri," she said. "Can I see Patrick?" Patrick dragged himself reluctantly down into the hall. Omri stood aside, waiting. He could feel himself tensing all over for fear that there was a car outside waiting to cart Patrick away. "Hi, Em. How's it going?" said Patrick carelessly. "Well, okay. Tam's leg's in a cast and she's better. Your mom sent me to find you. She wants you home now, and you're to come back with me." "Right now?" "Why, yes." I can't come now." "Well, why not?" Patrick dithered helplessly, trying to think of some excuse. "How are we supposed to get back?" "On the train, of course," said Emma. "Come on." Omri said, "Did you come here on the train?" "Yes, why?" "And you walked up the road to here, from the station?" "Yes." Omri thought of the skinheads. It was Sunday. Even the few who went to school or had jobs were free and on the prowl on Sundays. He himself never walked down Hobble Road on Sundays, if he couldn't possibly help it. "Did you meet anyone?" She shrugged. "A few boys hanging around. Real creeps, gross. I took no notice of them." Omri shivered, but then he remembered. There was a pretty good chance that he didn't have to be scared of that gang anymore. He had put his hand in his jeans pocket and fingered the little pin light the smallest of the burglars had dropped the night before. And remember, guys, a pin light's like a little flashlight. As he touched it, he felt something else. It was the key. A sudden flash of inspiration came to him, stiffening his whole body like a bolt of electricity. "Emma," he said in a queer sort of voice, "would you mind if I had a private chat with Patrick before he goes?" She looked at them from one of them to the other. "Well, what's the secret?" They both flushed. "Wait here, okay?" Omri gobbled. And then he pulled Patrick into the living room and closed the door. "You've got to get out of going home," Omri said. "I can't cope without you." "Well, what can I do? Break my leg?" "Well, if you had the bottle for it, you could throw yourself down the stairs. Probably do yourself some serious enough injury." "Thanks." "But I wasn't thinking of that. Tell Emma that you've left something upstairs. We'll go up to my room, and you can get in the chest with Boone's figure, and I can send you back to his time. All right, guys, the next chapter, and this is the final one that we'll be listening to this time, is chapter number 5, Patrick Goes Back. Patrick's face was blank for a moment, and Omri thought, he's scared, and who can blame him? But then he saw it wasn't that at all. Patrick simply hadn't been able to grasp the idea at first. All right, guys, I'm doing something a little different with this quiz, and you may think, well, this is really random. Well, that's because it is. Your secret code word to get credit on the quiz is pickle, P-I-C-K-L-E, okay? The word is pickle. Remember that, all right? Thank you. All right, let's keep reading. When he did first grasp it, not just his face, but his whole body seemed to light up with excitement. Wow, he said simply. You mean you'll do it? Are you kidding? Go back to real cowboy time, cowboy country, see Boone full size. Lead me to it, let's go. He bounded out of the living room and was halfway up the stairs before Omri had gathered his wits to follow. As he came into the hall, he noticed Emma standing much closer to the living room door than she had been before. Patrick had nearly bowled her over as he emerged. A suspicion struck Omri. Were you listening? Yes, she said at once, but I didn't understand what you were talking about. Ah, said Omri with relief. It crossed his mind that she was a very straightforward girl. At least Tamsin wouldn't have admitted eavesdropping like that. Not many people would. He gave Emma a closer look. She was a year younger than he was, which was why he had hardly noticed her at school. Somehow you only noticed your contemporaries or people ahead of you, but she'd been more or less around for most of his life. Odd that he'd never really looked at her before, and now he saw that she was quite a nice-looking girl. In a fair, snubby-faced way. She had freckles and large eyes, and was dressed in sensible jeans and a blue parka. She had her hands deep in her pockets and was gazing at him expectantly. What were you talking about in there? Private, said Omri. He glanced up the stairs. Patrick could already be heard thudding up the last flight to Omri's attic bedroom. Where's Patrick gone? Up to get his, pajamas and stuff. But he didn't take any last night. He just dashed out. Oh, well, anyway, he's gone up, said Omri feebly, making a move to follow him. Emma followed at his heels. He paused on the second steps. Can't you wait down here? Why? Well, we'll be right down. Can't I see your room? You saw mine, she said. Last night, when you came to our house, Mum moved Tam and me out so that Patrick could have it. Well, from above came Patrick's impatient voice. Come on, Omri, don't hang about. You wait in the living room, Omri said decisively. He turned away from her and ran upstairs. In his room, he found Patrick already climbing into the seaman's chest. Go on, I'm ready, send me. But Omri, having come up with this amazing idea, was already having second thoughts about it. Listen, how will I explain where you've gone? Don't. Get rid of Emma somehow, make her go home, and you can tell your parents that I went with her. But what happens when Emma gets back to her place without you? That is a good question. It'll be too late then. I'll just have vanished. He grinned all over his face with glee. No, you won't. You'll be in the chest. Your body will be, well, what if they start looking for you? Listen, this was your idea, and a fantastic one. Stop making problems. Pile all your junk on top of the chest like before, and they'll never even think to look there. But your mom will be dead worried. She's sure to ring up. Then Emma will say one thing, and I'll say another. And Patrick had been crouching in the chest, looking up at him. Now suddenly he stood up. His face had changed, and he looked quite fierce. I want to go back with Boone, he said. I've made up my mind, and I don't want you bringing me back after 10 minutes either. You had your adventure in the Indian village, and I know you had a rough time, but you saw it. You saw the battle. You experienced it. Now it's my turn, and I don't want to hear any of your feeble objections. Just put the key in the lock and turn it, will you? I'm the one who's taken the risk. All you're asked to do is stall everybody for a few days. Omri's mouth dropped open. A few days? Well, it's hardly worth going for less than that, Patrick retorted. That he would stay away for longer than a few hours had not been part of Omri's, as he now saw it, idiotic idea.
It could be dangerous. What if... And Patrick made a move as if to get out of the chest. Are you going to do it, or am I going to have to bash you? He growled. Omri was not afraid of him. They were evenly matched. He stood his ground. You don't have to use skinhead tactics, he said. Patrick looked sheepish. Sorry, you're always trying to hold me back from doing what I want to. But listen, we'd better decide beforehand when you're going to bring me back. Time works the same on both ends. So let's say a week from today. You're completely round the twist, said Omri.
A week? Anyone would think that you were going on a holiday. All right, lie down, I'll send you. But don't get too comfortable in Texas, because you'll be back before you know it if I get into any trouble about you, which I am bound to. Patrick stared at him for a moment, and then slowly took the small figure of Boone out of his pocket. Omri reached out and touched it. He wanted to touch Patrick, shake hands with him or something, but he didn't know how to do it. So he touched Boone instead and said, Say hello to him for me, and tell him to take good care of you. Patrick curled up in the bottom of the chest. Omri, feeling quite calm now that the decision was made, closed the lid. He took the key out of his pocket and stuck it in the lock on the chest. For a moment it hung there, its red satin ribbon hanging from its fancy top, and then Omri turned it firmly. At that moment he heard a small, shrill voice nearby. What Patrick do? Why move longhouse? Very bad move sick men. Make fear, make wound worse. Omri spun around. In order to open the chest, Patrick had lifted the seed tray with its precious miniature complement of Indians, healthy, injured, and dead, onto Omri's desk underneath his raised bunk bed. Omri had, for the moment, quite forgotten them, and now he saw Little Bear standing at the edge of the tray, his arms folded, and his face lit by Omri's desk lamp, a mask of reproach. In other words, guys, it kind of looked like he had a mean look in his face. What Patrick do in box? Omri crouched till his face was level with Little Bear's. Little Bear, Patrick's gone. We agreed that he should go back to Boone's time. He's going to stay there for a while, so if there's anything you need, you'll have to ask me. I ask you not fear, said Little Bear promptly. Omri suppressed a sigh. There wouldn't be much to ask about it if he knew Little Bear. Start with food. Wife must feed son. Need good food. Keep up strength. Oh, of course. Sorry. I almost forgot. Omri reached into his pocket and brought out his collection of cornflakes, bits of bacon, and toast, which he'd thoughtfully wrapped in a paper napkin. Of course, he'd left the mug of tea downstairs. He'd have to go and get it. Meanwhile, there was enough food to be getting on with for all of them, and Little Bear looked at the spread, sampled a chunk of crispy bacon fat, and grunted with grudging approval. But then he'd straightened up, his face once more a mask of seriousness. Not leave dead brave long time, Little Bear said. Send back. Own people find know what do. Obey custom for dead. Yes, said Omri. That's what we thought. When? Right away, said Little Bear, who was beginning to pick up some English expressions. We'll put them back in the cupboard, said Omri. He felt the cupboard was the right time vehicle for the little people, the chest for him and Patrick. The logistics of the thing were solved by Omri putting his left-hand palm upward on the soil in the seed tray, while Little Bear and the three healthy Indians carefully and reverently lifted the corpses, still covered with blood-stained cloths, onto it. Omri shuddered as he felt their body weight, the coldness of death against his skin. And then the burial party of four climbed into Omri's hand, and he slowly moved to the cupboard, which stood on the low table in the middle of the room. He opened the door. Two Indians climbed off his hand and over the bottom edge of the cupboard, and on the other two lifted the bodies one by one and handed them to the Indians, who then laid them on the floor of the metal cupboard. Omri reached over and took the key from the lock of the chest and inserted it into the keyhole of the cupboard. The burial party climbed out and stood in a line, looking at their dead comrades in silence. Little Bear, said Omri, what about if you all go back now? There's nothing to hang around here for, and there's a lot to do. Rebuilding your village. I'm sure Brightstalls would like to take the baby back and get on with her life. Little Bear looked at him and scowled with thought. Good, he said. Go back soon, right away. First, you send dead, and then take out plastique. Omri closed the door. He turned the key, and after a moment, he turned it back, opened the door, and removed some of the plastic figures. He knew that they were no use anymore. The people belonging to them were gone. He certainly wouldn't ever want to play with them. After a second's thought, he took a piece of white writing paper and, piling them into it, folded the edges carefully around them. I'll bury them, he said to Little Bear. That's our custom with dead people. Little Bear nodded grimly. Good. First we do dance. Ask Great Spirit brings safe to ancestors. Matron had come out of the longhouse, serving as a sort of field hospital for the injured Indians, and watched the removal of the dead, and now she called Omri over. I'm very much relieved that you've dealt with that matter, she said in her brisk way. Now, having disposed of the dead, do you think that you could give your urgent attention to the problems of those who are still alive? Omri felt a jolt in his chest. Now that Patrick had abandoned him, he must solve by himself the pressing problem of getting the medical team. Matron, look, he said, thinking aloud more than anything else. It's Sunday. I can't go to the shops. I thought I'd try to get some help from a friend who has plastic figures. Not exactly a friend. She's Patrick's cousin. Who, me? The jolt Omri had felt before was nothing to the explosive leap his heart gave at the sound of that voice. He spun around from his ill-balanced crouch, falling over backward, and sat gaping at the figure of Emma in the open doorway. All right, guys, that's our first 5 chapters. If you enjoyed doing 5 chapters instead of 3, of course, let me know about that. Just let me know if that was just right or if it was too many. Just give me your feedback, and we'll talk about it. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. And don't forget that code word that I had in there. That is your key to getting your points this week. Thank you. Bye.